Welcome everyone to this afternoon's lecture, and thank you for coming. I want to introduce myself to you first of all. Yat Esha Laura Tohi in the Shgatsena Hibilin Shlitology ni Bashashin. Ahya Ande Nokai DAWP Baltimore de Dibana Altehiki. Hello everyone, my name is Laura Tohi. I am Sleepy Rock people born for the Bitterwater Clan people. And I just want to thank you for those of you that have come to this event, to AWP. Some of you I know have come from a long way, so we're thankful that you're here and able to take in the talks and panels and this lecture and reading that's taking place now. The lecture you are about to hear, Writing the Things We Don't Talk About, will be given by Ramona Emerson, Diné, or Navajo, filmmaker and author of the supernatural crime fiction novel Shudder, which was a finalist for the PEN/Hemingway Award, PEN Open Book Award, and Edgar Award, among others, and its recently released sequel, Exposure. Emerson hails from Albuquerque, New Mexico, where she and her husband, producer Kelly Byers, run their production company, Real Indian Pictures. She's also an assistant professor at the University of New Mexico in the Department of Film and Digital Arts. This event is part of the AWP Tribal Colleges and Universities Fellowship Program, of which Emerson is serving as this year's creative advisor. The program is funded in part by a grant from the National Endowment for the Arts and is now in its second year. Through the program, AWP provides the opportunity for faculty and students from tribal colleges and universities to establish connections through mentorship and to share their work with the AWP community by awarding fellowships to attend every annual conference and book fair. Spotlighting Native creative writing talent is the core of this fellowship program. Today, you will all have the pleasure of hearing from this year's student fellows as they share excerpts of poetry, fiction, and memoirs that they have worked on under the mentorship of their faculty fellows. Following the students' reading, Ramona will take the stage and begin her lecture. Before we begin, I'd like to remind everyone that this event will be followed by a book signing outside of the ballroom. I'd also like to invite you to the TCU Tribal Colleges University Fellowship Program reception, which will be held tomorrow at 6 p.m. in the Renaissance Harbor Place Hotel. Join us in celebrating this program's second year and meet our talented fellows. You can find more details in the AWP mobile app schedule. So, without further ado, I'd like to welcome our first student fellows to the stage. Thank you very much for being here this afternoon and enjoy the event. And each of the fellows will introduce themselves before they give their reading. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. She'e Jamie Natanaba Hinashia. I'm from Fort Defiance, Arizona, the Navajo Reservation. And I'm reading a very short section of my memoir that's in progress. And I'm also coming to you from the MFA program at the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe. Okay, this is called Shema Rising. I remember my mother's soft skin as I soaped her back in a bath. It's 1986. I'm 4, and I've not learned to be ashamed of the human body yet. She was beautiful, with her hair a rich brown that turned red in the sun, a curly mane tendrilled across her shoulders, an echo of her laughter lifting into the shaft of light above us. I love her simply, proud in a way I will never be able to capture again. She is my mother, Shema, and I am her child, Ache'e. There is only distance, anger, and hurt ahead for us. But maybe in that moment, with my hands full of bubbles and her laughter, we were in tune. Like the female rain on pinon trees and the red sandstone of the res. I've not been able to bathe myself for the past week. It's 2016 and the amniotic sac around my daughter is leaking. Fear flows in me like the drip of the IV, pooling drop by drop, saturating my veins. The hospital shower is tiny, so small that my partner, Shush, must almost get in with me to help wash between my shoulder blades, like wings held taut to keep Sheche'e and her water in. He and I have carved out a life together over 6 years, and at last I am not ashamed to be naked. Bubbles on skin. The hospital bed is a barren plastic landscape where my back and legs are always slightly sweaty. A manufactured chill blasts the room I've been in for weeks. I feel sticky and sense that time is flowing faster now, clinging like a second skin. Vials of blood, IV changes, sleep in 1-hour intervals interrupted by nurses doing their rounds. All of it is a reminder that she is in danger. Life water is draining faster than we can create a steady stream. The doctors listen each hour to our heartbeats side by side and nod their heads in agreement. But today, their nods are hesitant and stormy, like winds gathering, glancing past my answers to the various monitors. The bleeding hasn't stopped. Shush says nothing is for sure yet, but I know in my bones that it is. Soon I will answer to the smallest person I have ever met and kneel at her feet forever. As I grew older, Kat's turbulent nature branched off from the gathering swell I was becoming. I was growing into hips and a story that echoed her inflamed nerves. Instead of becoming rapids, I'd cultivated an undertow and became a stranger she once fed. 8 hours of dissolving in pain. The doctors say the baby's heartbeat suggests struggle. I hear only hooves galloping in water. She's in trouble and they must get her out. Between peaks of breathless contractions, they wheel me into another sterile white room. It's here that they hold me firmly forward by my shoulders, then stab the space between the vertebrae of my spine. There is a difference in pain between needle and contraction, piercing of flesh against the very act of a woman's body expelling parts of itself. I cannot decide which mountain is harder to climb. The needle finds its way into the epidural space of my spine. I am 2 out of 3 parts of a whole. I feel a distant tugging behind the curtain draped across my shoulders, weight I sense without feel, like thick fog in deep breath. I've lost track of everything. When I realize Shush's face is above mine, he's glimpsed inside me, organs carefully moved around the open fabric of my skin. And then I hear her tiny cry. Somehow, I can still hear the hooves along the river, galloping away. My heart is beating somewhere else now. The rush of water stills after that one small cry. Thank you.
Me kuhuk, munti mi nosa plata mahe, mi gigo hanese, sha untakot ya tiwa. My name is Dominique J. Hunter. I am an Afro Yasa Saponi human being based in Durham, North Carolina. And I am enrolled also in the MFA program at the Institute of American Indian Arts for Creative Writing. I would like to also acknowledge Bise, a thank you to our Piscataway and Susquehannock nations who have called these shores home since time immemorial. And I will be reading two pieces from a manuscript that I'm working on called Whisper of Ancestral Seizure. The first is a lineated poem, and the second is an epistolary poem. And so I will be doing the first part of the lineated poem, the epistolary poem, and then ending with the second part of the lineated poem. Woe and retribution. Out of the fog she came, a woman with no name, a woman a doe the same, exposed and afraid, chased by chinokehe, blinded by rage. She darted into the night, colliding with headlights. She left only tufts of fur behind on the grill held together by kindred sinew for many moons and summers into the marshy dew, vanishing into the marshy dew. July 24th, 1721, 5.5 miles southeast of Saponi Town and Jonquita Pasu, Horse's Head River, inside Fort Christana, Shahun Untakot Yasaamai, Virginia. Ina, Kionska and I are Bika. Okay. They don't feed us much, even though it's summer and we are stuck inside most of the time, even on sunny days like today. It's hot beyond bearing with all these clothes they make us wear. I miss the river. Even though it's so close, I can hear it late at night. I miss you and Ati and Higon and all y'all. Most of us Niska sleep huddled together, but sometimes one will go to piss and get seized by a maganaga. They will come back sobbing or shaking or so still, saying nothing at all for days, like a ghost, like their spirit got left somewhere. That is until they get hit to speak in class. One Meharan boy now stutters. They kept hitting his knuckles until Hak Achuti Hieoka and his fingers bled. He used to be called Buck, but now Kabejash and some other mean kids call him Owl. Speaking of Chinokehe, one night Gita and I woke to the sound of a woman's voice. She was speaking English to the Maganaga, but she kind of laughed like auntie. Early the next morning, when we went to rinse our hands and faces in the basin, we saw deer tracks in the mud. We thought deer jump high, but not as high as the palisade walls. But in Na, there was only one pair of front hoof tracks, and they were followed by the tracks of Maganaga boots. Later that day, the men hurried around like pigeons being chased by dogs. Then Lieutenant Governor Spotswood himself demanded we tell him what we knew about John Young's disappearance. We shook, but said nothing because we knew nothing. We thought for sure he'd come back to beat us or would have the soldiers attack the villages. But some of the boys overheard the watchmen tell Spotswood that they saw John leave the fire. He was talking to himself and walking towards the privy. When they looked back up, he was gone. But they figured he was just drunk and passed out while taking a piss. The washroom was on the south side, and the gate was on the north side, and there was nowhere he could have gone. The whole thing got the Maganaga so spooked they never mentioned it again, but now they keep an even closer eye on us. That night in bed, when they finally stopped walking by our sleeping quarters, we whispered the story of the tracks to the other Niska. Some believed us, but others said we were lying. But after that day, John Young went missing. Buck stopped stuttering. They are watching more now, so wait 2 dark moons before sending Uncle to slip your water beneath the wall. Yando wa yiste kayim, signed Maktoka Komiha, Red Wolf Girl. Out of the mist she came, a woman knowing her name, a woman a doe the same, armed and unshamed, mother of Witae, ears alert attuned. She stepped out under the moon, bow strap hung loose, arrowheads ready to prove any man a fool who harmed her kin. She, protector of women, sits patiently in waiting. Be safe. Thank you.
Seguego. Elliot yon gets dano kong yang gahagani wa konjodo. O swegan to no Michigan de wagadegu. My name is Elliot Chamberlain. I'm Mohawk. My family's from Six Nations of the Grand River First Nation in southwestern Ontario, and I'm part of the fiction program at the Institute of American Indian Arts in the MFA. And I'm going to be reading a short story today. The story is called Nation Wake. Gunnar was a man who liked talking, and so he did at length, which was all the better for Vic, who was more content to sit and trace the pine ceiling beams of McGillicuddy's alehouse with his eyes, while his friend, or more nearly his acquaintance, a colleague from the copy shop whom he tolerated mainly out of boredom and perhaps pity, yammered on about matters of the past that couldn't be altered regardless of how many times they were rehashed, or whether anybody was listening, and Vic wasn't listening. He was instead busy tracing the ceiling beams, and when he'd finished with that, having slowly dragged his eyes across each of the 10-foot logs, centimeter by centimeter, noting every knot and crooked grain along the way, he moved on to the spider webs, following each strand of silk in the way he imagined that the spiders had done as they wove, while Gunnar, oblivious to Vic's focused wandering, went on doing a weaving of his own, a weaving together of the disjointed memories in his head, creating a tapestry to which nobody would listen, but which he nevertheless wove with tenacity and fervor, because Gunnar, who liked to talk, was comforted always by the presence of an audience, even though to talk he didn't really require one, and he never seemed to notice, or if he did notice, he did not care, whether the audience was paying any attention, and so when he did have an audience, willing or unwilling, attentive or inattentive, and tonight he had Vic, who was inattentive and yet more or less willing, Gunnar liked to regale them with the stories he considered his best, those he saved for special occasions, one of which usually began like this. I was in Afghanistan, Gunnar said. He was a man who valued setting the scene. Remember how I was in Afghanistan? And this question was, as were all Gunnar's questions, totally rhetorical and furthermore unnecessary. Over the past 6 months, Vic had heard, if not truly listened to, enough of Gunnar's meandering tales to absorb at least this basic detail. I was in Afghanistan with this guy named Henry. We were bunkmates, me and Henry. Anyways, Henry and me, we were always looking for ways to pass the time because we had the most boring job in the world. I'll tell you what's the most boring job in the world. We had to stand outside this abandoned shithole of a schoolhouse. The roof was half caved in and it didn't have a door. I mean a real shithole, totally abandoned, like I said. And we had to stand outside it on guard because our commanding officer thought maybe some confused little Afghan kids might come back, thinking they had school. I should say, little Afghan boys, because of course the Arabs. And when Gunnar said Arabs, which Afghans are not, the first A in the word was pronounced like the A in wake, or nation, or shame. They don't let girls go to school, so our commanding officer told us we had to stand watch because if any kids came back there might be landmines or something because the terrorists have a habit of targeting the schools, God knows why. But that was the reason that no fucking kids ever came to school in the first place, why it got abandoned, I mean, so it was totally pointless. But our officer didn't give a fuck and he didn't have shit else for us to do anyways, so me and Henry had to stand outside this dump in the desert, 115 fucking degrees, no shade to be had, not a goddamn tree in sight, and we had to just stand there. And here Gunnar might pause to cough, or take a drink of his beer, or maybe not. Pausing didn't much matter to him, because as far as he was concerned, pauses were only time that could be better spent talking. We just had to stand there and watch it, just the two of us, Henry and me, and so as you can imagine, we were bored as shit, and we were always trying to find some way to pass the time that wouldn't get us into trouble. You know, like games and shit, like, say, throwing rocks at a bigger rock, for example. That was something me and Henry used to have to do to keep us from shooting ourselves in the head. But then we kind of ran out of rocks, because like I said, you know, it's fucking desolate out there, so then we switched to word games. Like, for example, we'd try to come up with shit that rhymed with a word one of us would pick, like dick or cat, but as you can imagine, that got boring pretty fast, because there's only so many rhymes in the world. So then we moved on to whatever else we could think of, sleepover games even. I mean, it's embarrassing the things we had to resort to. 2 grown men in the desert, 2 American fucking freedom fighters playing truth or fucking dare outside of an abandoned schoolhouse. I mean, fucking little girls' games, and the dares couldn't even be any good. They had to be boring shit that kept us out of trouble, like, hey, I dare you to swallow a fingerful of sand, or hey, I dare you to give your applesauce to Velasquez at dinner at night, pretend you don't want it. And listen, the applesauce was the fucking good shit, man. I mean, that was the shittiest dare in the world because it wasn't even funny, and it sure as hell wasn't fun. And we'd be standing there doing this stupid-ass, boring-ass shit for hours on end. I mean, it never ended. Like, even when we got back to the base in the evenings, it didn't end, because all I could see when I'd shut my eye was that fucking sand and that fucking caved-in schoolhouse just swimming there, man. You know how it is. And Vic didn't know how it was. He suspected that nobody, save perhaps for Henry, who was apparently living a glamorous post-war life as a twice-married salesman in New York, knew how it really was. And besides, Vic had never been a soldier, or been to Afghanistan, or to any other desert for that matter. And for all the words Gunnar said, Vic never found any of them especially illustrative of some sort of larger picture. Gunnar's words were their own end. They were words for the sake of words. They occupied time. They were at best a spray-foamy filler, masked by feeble gestures towards a plot, a facade which only very thinly veiled the ever-expanding substancelessness beneath. You know how it is, Gunnar went on, and honestly, man, to this day, fuck, he said, like it was a period. Fuck, the only punctuation he ever seemed to use when he talked, and Vic, who was still staring at the ceiling, tracing the spiderwebs, hardly listening to or comprehending the deluge of words, nevertheless heard some visceral sound in Gunnar's voice that he hadn't before, something that compelled him to tear his gaze away from the ceiling just in time to see tears well up in Gunnar's eyes before he covered them with his veiny red hands. I know people, Gunnar gasped, head in his palms, chest hunched towards his knees, who watch their buddies get blown up by grenades and shot by snipers. And Henry and me, we waited for that to happen. Every day we waited, waiting for anything like what you see in the movies or the stories the other guys told us, or even like the fucking army ads on TV. We waited to see who'd snap first and shoot the other one or himself in the face. We just waited and watched that shithole caved-in schoolhouse, and the grisliest thing I ever saw was a disgusting fucking sunburn that Henry got on the back of his neck, fucking blistered over, peeled off like dried glue, leaking pus and everything. But I can't. And Gunnar was sobbing in earnest now, and Vic was paying more attention to him than he ever had in his life, had forgotten all about the ceiling beams and spiderwebs, was pushing napkins helplessly at Gunnar down the bar, was tempted even to put a hand on Gunnar's shaking shoulder. I was getting paid to eat 3 meals a day and stand outside an abandoned building, Gunnar cried, and I've never been so goddamn bored in my life, so goddamn bored and so goddamn terrified that the boredom would end, and it never did. Not one thing that wasn't fucking boring ever fucking happened to me over there, and still, how pathetic is this, man? I still can't fucking sleep some nights because all I can see is miles and miles of sand. Nyalwa, thank you.
Yate, She'e, Talia Begay, and She. My 4 clans that I represent today are Tuaglini, Maidishkijni, Tachitni, and Bitatni. The poem I'm reading today is called Sky. My parents, in their own selfish ways, named me after a piece of themselves, damning me to become them or perish. But Shimasane named me after the sky, something ever-changing but permanently stuck above everything else. My parents' false names meant nothing to me, as they always had. My Shimasane always knew the right things to do. I trust in her tuition just as I always had. I look up and I feel her presence within and without. Watching me, we always spoke in code, her and I. My name was not just a word, but a living embodiment of adapting during hard times, a symbol of sovereignty over myself and my life. My clouds are always moving and my sun will always shine. My stars will continue shining, and my moon will always be beautiful. My lightning is the rage under my skin, and my rain is the weight of the world falling down on itself. I am sky for all that she is and means. I have a second poem, too, that I'm going to read. This poem is called Land Back. Being a Navajo means to survive. That is what they say. Home is where you are born, but it is also where you are first abandoned. You must endure, just like your ancestors, taught to fight, but not for what is rightfully yours. Born in a place that should be familiar, yet falls far from your own, like walking on another planet, full of emptiness, filled to debris and decay, a grave full of my people's history. Home is where I survived from, where I learned to endure. with a body already beaten before I could even breathe. Learning to survive without the water contaminated by greed. I walk through a land that doesn't welcome me, where my footsteps are erased by the wind. The animals share this land, but their eyes tell me I am foreign. The mountains stand over me, daring me to come closer. Home is the place that I run to and from when the weight of survival is too much. When they say we carry the strength of the earth, but I think we also carry her rage, rage for her loss and rage for her love. We learned how to take from her and give nothing back. She gives and gives and gives, her body, the landscape, her children, the animals, her emotions, the weather. She is rightfully angry. Her door is closed now, but still she waits, as a mother on the couch waiting for a curfew, while we've been left standing outside, longing for a home we once knew. To enter, we must change, learn to listen, to give back what was taken, and honor what was lost. Only then will she open the door, welcoming us in, no longer strangers, but her children once again. And that's all. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Yat she Ramona Emerson in she tlashi in shle nakadine bashichi dochini doshiche nakadine doshinale. I would just like to say, please, can you give another round of applause to the wonderful writers that we just listened to? There is a reason that they're here, and the reason is that their writing is so extraordinary. And I was lucky enough to be able to read it, and I was deeply affected by all of their work. And so, congratulations to all of you. You've done such a great job. So here today, I'm going to talk to you about writing about taboos. I am strangely one of the first Diné people to write about taboos, to the extent that which I have. And I'm so honored that I'm here to talk to you all about that today. I kind of have an agenda because I'm a big nerd. But we don't necessarily have to follow it. But I wanted to talk about the importance of writing about taboos, not just for Diné people, but for everyone. I think taboos, writing about taboos and what is considered taboo are subjects that are being avoided, shrouded in silence. It presents unique challenges and responsibilities. So for writers, students, educators, engaging in these topics will give you a greater understanding, and it'll encourage dialogue. It'll challenge harmful stereotypes. However, it also demands a thoughtful and respectful approach that centers around cultural sensitivity and ethical practice. And so, what are some of these topics that aren't supposed to be talked about? So taboos exist in every society, and especially in Diné traditions. So for many communities, including indigenous groups like the Diné, discussing certain subjects such as death can carry deep spiritual and social consequences. As writers, it's essential to approach these boundaries with humility and respect. Sorry. So I'm going to skip straight to Diné taboos because I feel like this is something directly tied to what I write about. Now, when I started to write Shutter, my first novel, I was writing from a perspective of somebody who worked in forensics for over 16 years. And I knew that there were other Diné people that, like me, were working in a space that dealt with death on a daily basis. So when I'm talking about these kind of jobs, I'm talking about doctors, EMTs, nurses, people who see death but are also Diné. And how do we deal with those issues? How do we deal with the cultural ramifications of working around death, of working around these taboos? And so I started to think about my story and about how I could affect those issues surrounding taboos. And what a better way than to tackle it straight from my experience, the 16 years in working in forensics? And how did it affect me as a Diné woman working in forensics? How did I look past those times of seeing death and seeing all of this trauma that was happening in front of my camera? And this was a daily thing for 16 years. So the Diné people have a very rich tradition about not talking about death at all. And it's surrounded by very powerful taboos. And now, historically, these taboos are linked to ideas about spiritual balance, protection from harmful forces, respect for the deceased. So death is not only a physical event for the Diné, it is a spiritual transition. And talking about it carelessly can give you negative consequences. And so how do you find that balance? How do you find that place where it feels safe to talk about these things that we've been told and taught our entire lives not to speak about? So in specific beliefs and practices amongst the Diné, some of the things that we completely avoid is talking about the deceased and mentioning their names, keeping their belongings, specific mourning rituals and periods of separation that you need to go through as part of the practice of grieving, protective ceremonies that will shield the living from spiritual harm moving forward. So when I was working on this on Shutter, I was thinking about these practices as looking for justice, not only talking about death and talking about death practices and about the traditional belief systems, but how are we bringing knowledge to people about what's going on in Indian country? What is happening to indigenous people in the cities and the border towns surrounding our reservations? So this was important to me because I knew that as Diné women, we are victims. We are so highly more percentage of victims in these circumstances, and I wanted to tackle those situations immediately. And so it was easy for me to think about all of the cases that I had worked on over those 16 years and bring real cases into a fictional space and talk about how those things were affecting us and talk about how, in my case, Rita Tota Cheatney, my character in Shutter and Exposure, how is she able to deal with this? And as if you've, spoiler alert, if you haven't read Shutter or Exposure, our main character can speak and communicate with the other side. Now, this is something that as Diné people, when I was trying to look for plot and look for ways to talk about this, I realized pretty quickly that that was the thing that was going to make this story different. I had never heard about a Diné person being able to speak to the other side. For me, it was the scariest thing that could ever happen to a Diné woman. And it would be like, for me, when I was thinking about this as a plot line, I was thinking about like, what is probably like the worst thing that could happen to a Diné woman as a young girl? Like, what could happen? And that was it for me. Like, if you could speak to the other side as a small child, you would be ostracized in your community. People would think you were a witch. Like there would be a whole nother thing added to this already, rough existence living on the reservation. And so I knew that not only would it bring conversation to the idea about Diné death belief practices, but it would also lend to the other situation where she is actively taking photographs at crime scenes and she's able to see the victim standing right in front of her. Like, how you can't just go to your sergeant and tell them, oh yeah, I know exactly how that person was murdered because their ghost told me and they're standing right there. So we had to figure out, in my mind, how are we going to work these things around? And I think as part of it was the traditional belief systems and those spiritual beliefs about death that guided those two conversations, because I was able to think about it with reverence, with respect. And a lot of people have asked me about that, like, how do you write about that? How are you able to write from that side? And that's how I write about it, because when I was a forensic photographer and I was taking photographs of people both dead and alive, my thought was always like, this person was somebody's daughter. This person was somebody's mother, somebody's sister. And it's my responsibility as the photographer, as the person who's there to document this time and space, to have reverence, to know that I have to take photographs the correct way. I had to follow protocol, because if I did not, then I would be affecting their cases. So in that way, I was writing about that from that space. I am writing about these women and their histories and about what happened to them. And I'm taking real, true stories and adapting them into fiction. And how do I do that with reverence and respect and responsibility? So that's always the way I come at this subject matter, always with reverence. And I think it shows through. It's never about the violence. It's about who they are. It's about where they come from and who their ancestors were. So for me, that's the space. You come to it with respect, you come to it with reverence, and you come to it with a great deal of responsibility. So at the same time, I was also working on a Hulu series as a director. A Hulu series called Out There, Crimes of the Paranormal. And during that series, we were actually discussing the case of Sarah Saganitso, who was a Diné woman who was murdered in Flagstaff, New Mexico in the 1980s, in 1987. And as part of this practice, the production company wanted me to speak with a traditional practitioner as part of the series. And how are we going to deal with this woman? We're not supposed to talk about death. We're not supposed to talk about people who have passed over. But in the case of this case, Sarah Saganitso in the Hulu series, I knew that when I reached out to a traditional practitioner within Flagstaff and I asked him if he would be willing to comment on this case that took place in his hometown, he remembered her. He remembered the case, even though it was like 40 years ago, and he knew that it was important. Is it okay to talk about them in that manner when we knew that she still didn't find justice? And so I had a lot of trepidation about asking this traditional practitioner to talk about this, to indeed ask him to go against protocol, to go against our belief systems in order to address this situation. I was very scared about what he might say in that case. I was happy when he told me that he would be willing to do it, first of all, because I was asking, which I was super excited about, but also because he knew that we had forgotten who she was. We knew that the case was an injustice. What happened during that case was an injustice, and that we needed to say her name again. We needed that chance to let her tell her story. We had to give a chance for her family to tell the story of Sarah and what happened to her. It was emotional. It was an intense moment, but it was something that needed to happen. So yes, sometimes we will break that protocol because we need to. Because we need to educate, we need to inform, we need to bring people into that sphere so that they understand what is happening. And so Sarah Saganitso's case is a really important case, and it taught me a lot about how we deal with death practices. And from that point on, this traditional practitioner has been a big part of my life. When I have questions about traditional and cultural beliefs as the Diné, I always come to him first and ask him, is this okay? Should I be saying this? And he'd always say, well, as long as you have respect and you're doing it in the right way, then you need to do it. You're educating people about what goes on here. And so it's very important. It's not always easy, but it's important. So what are some of these taboos? And it's not just the Diné people who have taboos. I mean, the whole world, I think, has some kind of cultural beliefs surrounding superstitions. I think maybe some examples like walking under a ladder. Actually, I had no idea where that superstition came from, but I found out actually that came from Egyptian origins, and it was something about the construction of the pyramids and breaking the holy seal by going underneath the triangle, right? So that breaking of the seal, all these years later, have informed us not to step under a ladder. It has no two completely different connections, right? But that's where it comes from. It's somewhere else. Do we still walk under ladders? Probably not, because it's unsafe, not because of superstitions. And so looking at superstitions and how they're built and how our culture builds around that tells you a lot about what do we really practice, what do we really believe, and what do we really think, right? Are there real world ramifications that don't have any connection to stereotypes? And that's one of them I found. Also, knocking on wood. I had no idea that Celtic belief systems, well, they believed that the spirits and gods lived in the wood. So when things were made out of wood, you would knock on them and ask for protection from these gods that lived inside the wood, or that furniture, chairs, tables were built on. And that's people's connection. That knocking on wood for protection is still linked to our belief systems today, even though we have no idea where that comes from. We'll just say something, oh, knock on wood. But we don't know why. We don't understand why. So that was always the thing for me. Like, why do we do these things? And when I was a kid, I would always say, my grandma would tell me, like, oh, well, you can't whistle at night, or you can't brush your teeth at night. You can't brush your hair at night. I would be like, you can't do anything at night, Grandma. Like, we can't do anything. We can't go anywhere. And she would, why was always my question. Why? And she would get tired and she would just say, because that's what we believe. Because that's how it is. That's what it's all attached to. And there are deep spiritual and traditional belief systems that started that. Okay. And do we necessarily know where those origins are? Not for all of them, right? But in my research for Shudder, I really started to look at, why are we so afraid of death? Like, what is that thing? Why do we have these specific rituals that go along with it? The 4 days of mourning, the removing of the body from the place that it was, or from the house, and the keeping away of the family, and all of these, very traditional belief systems. And how did that even develop? And so in the course of doing my research, I linked a lot of belief systems to the trauma and the things that happened to us over the years as Diné people. One of them being the Spanish flu epidemic in the early 1900s, and how we lost thousands of people to the Spanish flu, and again also during the COVID pandemic. Okay, so both of those issues that have affected us deeply. Navajo Nation was one of the most deeply affected communities in the world when COVID struck. And when it did, things started happening to Diné people. And what was that? They started to take advantage of us. We started to lose our own traditional death practices. Because if you really look at what the traditional death practices are, you are not supposed to do so many things that the Christian and the funerary industry does to our families. That was never what we were supposed to do. Never. But that's what we do now. And so a lot of my own mentors, people like Dr. Jennifer Dale, when I've talked to her about these situations and I've asked her about those death practices, she always would tell me, well, yah, right? They always say yah. That's like a phrase that we say when we're scared of something, like something is scary. And the Diné people will say to each other, yah, right? But when Dr. Dale and I talk about yah, she said, that's just irrelevant. That's just a thing that people say to scare each other. But really, can we really complain about these death practices can we call ourselves out about how we talk about death and how we talk about Navajo spirituality when we're not even following our own traditional protocols? And so how is tradition affected by the current world? How do we look at death practices in today's world? And how has that been affected? How has today's world affected how we believe? So I think more than just superstition, I think what my book Shudder and also additionally Exposure discuss our grief. Oh no, I'm talking about death, and people tend to look at what I'm discussing as, oh, you're talking about death. But when you really read into those death practices and you talk about what's going on in the Navajo lives and how they are being affected, we're talking about the larger question of grief. When I was a young girl and my grandma would come to visit me, I would always cry after her when she would leave. Or when I had to leave grandma's house and I had to go back home, I would cry. And my grandma would always tell me, don't cry. You're not supposed to cry after somebody because you're sending them off in a bad way. You're not supposed to do that. And as a child, I always thought, well, why am I not allowed to grieve? Why am I not allowed to be sad? Why am I not allowed that time and that space to have that for myself? And it was a question that I've asked all the way into adulthood, but I think what it is really more about the Diné teachings and the suppression of emotion, and we have to start questioning that. So a part of writing about death is questioning those superstitions, those belief systems that we've been taught our whole lives, and really examining how they affect us in our current times. Like, is it allowing us time to grieve? Are we giving ourselves the emotional space to move on? Right. So those are some of the issues that I've been dealing with, as far as how the superstitions and all of that are weaved into my writing. But when we look at things like the Spanish flu epidemic, and we look at all of these other things, we see the direct effects of contemporary life on what has happened to our traditional belief systems. So in the case of the Spanish flu, so many people were forced to grieve quickly, to do the death practices and all of the things that happened quickly because they were afraid to get sick as well. Same thing happened during COVID. We had to bury loved ones with minimal ceremonies. We had to abandon homes where somebody had died. And then in some traditional prohibitions, handling the dead were breached because of necessity, because we didn't want to get sick. We didn't want the family to get sick. And so a lot of that was affected by these pandemics, by what happened. And so the direct superstitions with nuances and all of that, showing the complexity and meaning to our traditional practicing beliefs, and they have to consider the impact of these things on our stories. And so for me, not only addressing these issues of death, but also telling the truth about what's going on in our communities and allowing space to have these conversations where we talk about it, which is something we are specifically told not to do. Never talk about death. You never talk about taboos because it'll come and get you. And so after I've decided to write 2 books about death, when I show up at an event, that's always one of the first events I ever had was at the Navajo Nation Library right in the center of Window Rock. And the very first question I received when I arrived there was, "Why do you write about death?" Right away, one of a Navajo lady walked up. I knew she was going to ask me. Somehow I knew she was going to ask me that question. And that was my biggest fear, was that, somebody was going to come in and confront me in a public space about what I was writing about. And that's a very real fear that I think a lot of us as Diné writers carry. Like, what is this impact of my writing going to have on my community? And how are they going to react to what I've written? So when I talked to her and she asked that question, I explained to her that there are a lot of Diné people who do the same work that I did, which was forensics, people who work as doctors, people like, that work in the death industry. And how do they survive? How do they live? How do they continue to do their work? That's their calling. That's the work they've decided to do. And yes, it deals with a taboo, but it doesn't make their work any less valuable. Their work is important. Their work is valuable. It finds justice for people. And so it's essential. And yes, it may put us in danger, traditionally, spiritually, emotionally, but it's something we've been called to do. And if it's something that we do well, it's something that we must continue to do. So I enjoy having those conversations with people, finally being able to say the things that we have always been afraid to talk about. I've always been afraid to talk about death until I worked in forensics, and then it was different for me. It was a different thing. It was finding justice. It was winning cases. It was giving people voice, and also creating dialogue and allowing people to learn more, even Diné people, about where our traditional belief systems really are and where we are in this moment. So in addition to my book, Shutter and Exposure, other Diné authors have also decided to write about death, about different things, grief, trauma, these things that are, again, very taboo in our culture. But I wanted to find out, how do these Diné people talk about it? In addition to how I talk about it, I think they're coming from a different space. They don't have forensics background. They have a completely different background than I do. And so I was really interested in their work and how they were able to navigate these spaces. And learning about how they confront grief, learning how they confront trauma, because that's what it was really about for all of us when we really discussed these issues. I really enjoyed speaking with Stacey Dinette Sosi. If you have not read her collection of short stories, I highly recommend them. So when I talked with Stacy, and she said when approaching these topics, I was worried that in my community I would receive backlash because we are supposed to avoid the topics of death. So Stacy was feeling the same thing I was feeling in a very, very similar way. She has a story in this collection about a person riding in the back of a vehicle with a coffin that has her uncle in it, and talking about death, talking about like snow baths, and talking about Alexa, like mixing traditional belief systems and practices with contemporary issues, because that's where we are. We can't just stay in the past. We can't stay stuck into superstitions without explanations. And I think in a lot of ways, because we're having these conversations and we're questioning the origin of these stories, we're able to move past that. We're able to move into a different place. So within our communities, even though sometimes we're called out, and often we are, I've also been approached by other Diné people who come to readings and to see and to talk about this. They say, well, Ramona, I had a really hard time reading your book, and I came to this chapter. There's a chapter in there where your character's mother dies, and I had to stop reading. This woman affected me deeply when she came to my reading. And she said I couldn't move past it, that chapter. And I think it was because I felt a connection there. I felt I had never grieved the death of my own mother in all of these years. Because of our traditional teachings, I'd never talked about her. I stopped my mourning short because I wasn't supposed to carry on with my grief, because I felt like I'd keep her in this world. But once I started to read your book, I realized that it might be okay to grieve. And she said, and when I read that chapter, I cried really, really hard for like 2 days. And then I came back to your book and I finished it. And she just said, thank you for allowing me the chance to grieve and to feel the trauma that I had been suppressing for like 20 years. Because that's what my traditional beliefs taught me, was to hide it, to push it down, to not deal with the grief. And she said, so in that way, thank you. Thank you for saying it out loud, the things that we're always afraid to talk about. It's important. Yes, it's scary. I was scared. Stacy was scared. We are scared because this is pushing back on hundreds of years of teaching and traditional beliefs and superstitions. But it's necessary. I think it's necessary for us to grieve. And it's necessary, I think, also for us to remember that we are connected to our lands, and we are connected to the events that happened to our ancestors. And a great example for us is the Long Walk. Our ancestors endured years and years of death and trauma so that we would be allowed to still be here. Like, their blood is still in our veins. We still walk on the land that they walked on. We are still a part of that world. And that's why we're here. We are here because of what they endured and the trauma that still flows in our blood. And so while we're writing about the entity, whether it's a ghost or it's a colonialism, I think even though you would argue I'm writing specifically about death, when you read heavier into both novels, I'm talking directly about colonialism and about the death of our cultures and about the death of our people. And that's what is important about writing about death. That's why it is essential to our writing practice. And through creative writing and understanding things our own way, I think it can inform our grief, our death, and our rebirth. And as women, as Navajo people, this taboo towards death is a reaction of us being forced to carry our grief. We are carrying our grief. We're carrying our family's grief. We're carrying our ancestors' grief. And writing about that is our way of creating ceremony around it. By writing about it, we are creating ceremony. We are creating the healing, the start of a healing practice. So by writing down our trauma, we are healing through documenting the process of grief. And so on while on the exterior, it may seem like we're writing crime fiction, paranormal, scary books, horror books, stories about death, we're really writing about our ancestors and about the grief that we continue to carry into our lives. So it's important to put that grief down by writing it down and making a story from it and informing and teaching others about why this happened and about why we're here and why we are still alive. Another Navajo author who also wrote about death in his first novel is Brendan Basham. His book, Swim Home to the Vanished, is a direct memoir, magical realism novel about Brendan's grief over his brother's death. Also a book I highly recommend. But he, in a very magical realist way, he follows a character who moves through different worlds, constantly in search of finding his dead brother. Where did he go? You know, he committed suicide, he's gone, and he never had a chance to say goodbye. And this, in this way, this is Brandon's laying his trauma down and being able to finally grieve a brother that he didn't understand, finally being able to talk about that process of grief and realizing that it's an important part of his own dialogue. Brendan says, at a certain point, it felt like I was speaking to the past. It wasn't that I wasn't coming to terms with the grief of my brother, but the fact that my native upbringing had affected me so much. My great-grandfather was born on the Long Walk in 1864. He was a medicine man and died at 104 in 1968. I wish I had a chance to meet him. And when you mind the subconscious, the meaning starts speaking to you. It took some mining, and there's magic in that world, and we can't control it. To get to it, we have to dig deep. For hope, you need despair. Stanley Milford's The Paranormal Ranger is another book that doesn't really deal with grief specifically. It's not a fiction novel. It is a nonfiction memoir about his life as a ranger, a Navajo ranger. Also highly recommend. But he talks about death in a very different way. In every culture, there are taboos, forbidden acts, behaviors, objects, and even thoughts. These taboos exist to prevent people from causing something bad to happen, usually as a result of a supernatural phenomenon. So if you have not read The Paranormal Ranger, he basically worked for 30 years in some investigative context. Navajo Rangers are the ones that get sent out when you see a UFO, when you see a Inagloshi, when you see Bigfoot in your backyard. Who do you call? The Navajo Rangers. And Stanley Milford actually was a Navajo Ranger. He worked in the FBI, worked in Navajo police. He worked in several law enforcement places. But what is so interesting about his story is the fact that he is so matter of fact about it. He's very analytical. He talks about these things that happen. He has actual interactions with ghosts and paranormal activity that continue to follow him throughout his life. And he's like, yeah, it's there. Yeah, that ghost came home with me. Yeah, coins appear out of nowhere in my house. Yeah, this knife tried to stab my friend's basket in his living room. It's terrifying. Because it's real. But he talks about it very analytically. From a Diné perspective, he's Diné and Cherokee. But he knows what our cultural practices are. He understands the taboos. And he gives you a very analytical explanation of why it happens and why we are adverse to it, but also why it won't hurt us unless we allow it to, which I think is a really important point. I think he's very truthful about how we allow this to happen by being afraid of it. We allow it to happen by not dealing with our taboos, not dealing with our own trauma and our own grief. So what are the ethical considerations that I have for you to write about these things? All I can say is that as a writer, I did a significant amount of research, and I know that all of the writers that were writing, Stacy, Brendan, even Stanley Milford, went through months and months of research to make sure that we were doing this correctly. As I mentioned before, I talked to traditional practitioners, I talked to doctors, I worked in forensics myself for many years, I talked to police officers, I actually attended CSI classes so that I could make sure that this was absolutely true, and I didn't have any police officers coming to me and telling me that my story was not true and I wasn't talking about correct procedures and all of these things. I hate that. So I had to get it right. I did an exceptional amount of research. And if you intend on writing about these things, I suggest that you do. And if one other thing too is if like if you can't write about it, they tell you not to write about it, don't. I've had a lot of those things where I have that information. They may be like doing research with me, telling me about these things, but then they say, but I don't want you to write that. I don't want you to share that story. Is that okay? And I'm like, yes, absolutely. That story is for me and you, and it's not for anybody else. But it informs me. It informs my characters. It informs the story. But I don't necessarily have to put it down on paper, and I don't have to point it out and say, this happened, this guy told me. Okay? That's respect, reverence, right? Requesting permission to share stories is really important. And then asking right off the bat, do you have any issues with that? Should I not share that? Is that okay? It's really important to interview people, to talk to culture bearers, to talk to traditional people, and to get that information. And also, if you're not from this community, and you're not from this tribe, and you're not from these belief systems, you need to question whether you should be writing it at all. Okay, those are important. Those are important stories for our people. And so when outsiders come in and they write about us, they write from this other fictional space that doesn't exist. They write about us as ghosts, as witches, as all of these things that Western culture has taught them to write about to scare people or to freak people out. But they're not writing about us because we don't believe that. We would never talk about those things. We would never address those issues because we know better, because our grandparents and our relatives and our ancestors have told me and told us not to do that, and we won't. We only write within the borders of what we have been allowed to respectfully share. And so if you notice when you read Shutter and Exposure, I don't talk about what happens in those ceremonies. I don't talk about what the medicine man says to Rita or what happens. And people ask me, how come you don't ask? How come you don't write that in there? It's none of our business. It's between Rita and her medicine man. And it's not my business. It's not ours to share on the page. Even though I'm writing about a fictional person, I still feel very, very strongly about that. It's still her space. It's still our beliefs, and it doesn't need to be out there. And so I think when you're writing these spaces and you don't, like I say, if you don't come from those places, really think about that. Doesn't matter how much research you do or how many people you interview, it still doesn't give you the agency to write from that space. Oops. Oh, I went ahead. Sorry. I'm almost there. I'm looking at my time here. So when you're writing also, I would consider, you could people I think tend to just look like the internet about the Navajo belief systems and those types of things. And Stacy and I talked about that, like the idea of traditional people sharing videos on TikTok, and showing things that we're not supposed to show. We're never supposed to videotape or photograph those things. And now you see it all the time on YouTube and TikTok. And what it does is it commodifies our culture. It sells our culture, and it sells it short, right? We're not supposed to share those places. And even though I remember as a filmmaker, I've had several opportunities to go in and film that, be in that ceremony with my camera, but I don't, right? Because I'm not supposed to. It's not something that's supposed to be shared. That moment is for me to put the camera away and to look at it with my own eyes and record it in my own brain, and that's it. That's it. That doesn't need to go any farther than that. So I think a lot of people just tend to you'll look at Navajo taboos and people will just list them. You're not supposed to do this. You can't look at a snake eat. You can't, you can't do this. And it's like this huge litany of hundreds of things and rules that you can and cannot do with no explanation as to why. And when you do that, it's backwards. It makes it look strange. It makes it look odd. Like I say, it commodifies it, just like sharing it on YouTube and TikTok and any of these other platforms. And so in that way, it's really important to think about what you're putting out in the world and make sure that you're sharing it the way that your grandma would say is okay. Back in the 80s, I watched a film called Navajo Talking Picture by a Navajo director named Arlene Bowman. And the film is about her as somebody who grew up in the city, just graduating from UCLA film school and going into back home after not being there and being completely culturally removed from her family for many years. She goes back and starts videotaping her grandmother. And her grandmother is not happy about it and chides her constantly, like, get that camera out of my face. And she's speaking to her totally in Navajo. So Arlene doesn't understand it because she doesn't speak Navajo. And I think if you ever have a chance to watch that film, that's that cultural disconnect that I'm talking about. Like not thinking about what you want is not necessarily what you need to do. She wanted to, I think, have connection with her grandmother by going back there and filming her and learning about who she was and where she came from. But at the same time, she was creating this huge wedge between the two of them, using that camera and being in her face when she didn't want her to be. And so in that way, I think that film is a huge learning lesson about the appropriate way to look at and challenge these issues and think about what do you really want to talk about and what do you want to explore and what do you want to expose as far as your own Diné culture, and really limit that to what you can feel is reverent and what you can feel is respectful. Now, the most powerful writing is both truthful and kind, and honoring the stories that are shared, but also honoring the silences that you are to maintain. So as you do the research and as you move forward as writers, it can be hard. The research of this can get really heavy and it can weigh down on you. I indeed have times in my own life writing about these issues, writing about Rita and writing some very intense and very explicit crime scene chapters. I have moments where I have to let it sit. I have to let it move away from me, because even as somebody who worked in forensics, who's somebody who thinks that I can just do this and be untouched by it, I feel it. You can't help but feel it. You can't help but have a connection to the cases that you're talking about, the people that lost their lives in these cases. So you have to remember to ask yourself if you are getting too close to it, to the darkness, to the trauma that we write. So in this way, we have to remind ourselves that we have to also take care of ourselves as writers. We have to write, sometimes we have to write darkness, but sometimes we have to take a break from the darkness and take care of ourselves. That should be part of the process. We have to limit the power of trauma and grief by not allowing it to move from the page into our waking lives. And that's what I mean when I tell you sometimes it gets too heavy and sometimes you need to let it sit down. So while I encourage you to write these honest and true stories and do them with reverence, you must also remember that we are creating ceremony by writing. The act of writing this trauma and dealing with the grief is part of that ceremony. Writing those pages and sitting there at your typewriter or your computer and laying these stories down and remembering your ancestors and what they did for you is part of this process. So this is the power of story. And this is why story must always be protected. So please remember to take care of yourselves and to, yes, create that ceremony for yourself, and remember that your words extend far out into the world And so be very careful about how you use them. Thank you.